That was extremely stressful. I had 3 months to figure out what I was going to do. Hi, I'm Dana, and last year I moved off-grid and I failed. I bought a 1-acre property in New Mexico. It was completely raw, so no buildings, no utilities whatsoever. My plan was to build a small homestead for myself that would serve as a home base, and then build a 3-unit luxury feeling glamping vacation rental getaway. Clearly that did not happen, and I want to make this video so you guys can learn from my experience, learn from my mistakes, and hopefully have a better chance at your off-grid venture. If you hear snoring in the background, it's a little red dog. She's 11 years old and she likes to be near me all day and usually snoring. I'm going to try to talk about my experience off-grid in a few different videos. The first one that you're watching right now will be about what happened before I went off-grid, and I think that that's important because everything that you do before you go off-grid affects you when you're off-grid. And then in subsequent videos, I'll talk about what happened when I was actually on my property. With that in mind, here is what happened. Before I moved off-grid, I spent about 2 years doing a ton of research. I decided what type of structures that I wanted to build, which is this 3-unit vacation rental. And then I researched what type of building materials I wanted to use. I ended up on HyperAdobe. I like the idea of using earth to build buildings, not only because it's naturally insulating, but it's healthier than a lot of building materials and it can be more affordable. I researched what kind of equipment that I would need, soil conditions, permit laws, on and on. I researched how to get water off-grid, how to get electricity, what to do with trash, how to get your mail. I watched a lot of YouTube videos about people who were living off-grid and building off-grid and just how they survived. I felt like the research I did was like really in depth and I had a good time doing it. It was super fun seeing different people's lives and the different things that they were building and how they were building it and how different everyone's situation was, but also kind of how similar. And it was super fun like planning out my dream. The majority of my planning was for South Carolina because that's where I was living at the time at my parents' house. And my plan was to be able to buy property within a couple hours drive of my parents' home. That way I could spend all week out building and camping on the property and then have the weekends to come back home, rest, do laundry, eat food, clean up anything, repack anything, get supplies that I would need for my next week out on the property building. And this was most appealing to me for multiple reasons, but the main one is my health. I've been battling chronic illness for a decade now, and unfortunately in 2018 I left my career behind, I immigrated to a different country, and I married the wrong person. He promised me to provide for us if we were ever low on money, and begged me to marry him and move and live with him and that I could rest and heal. But unfortunately that was all a lie. Because of that, I ended up spending 3 horrible years in a toxic marriage to an angry, critical person who I couldn't trust anything that they said because they lied about basically everything. And we had almost no money the entire time, which also meant that we didn't really have money to buy enough food. So I was literally starving. At one point I calculated how many calories I was eating a day and it was 900. And when I told my husband that, he told me that's a lot of calories. That's so insane to say to someone. I started having like a lot of other health symptoms because of the starvation and the toxic marriage. It ultimately contributed to me getting potassium deficiency, which I didn't know what was going on at the time. I just knew that it was really hard to lift my body. And if you know anything about potassium deficiency, you know that it can be deadly. It felt like I was dying. It was so painful. My husband came up to me one day and told me it would just be easier if I died. I started having these dreams towards the end of my marriage where this dead woman would come up to me and ask me if I was going to get out of there alive. And then she would maniacally laugh in my face. It was really freaky. And at the time I didn't know what was going on with my body, and I'd been dealing with chronic illness for so long that I didn't think I was dealing with something deadly. You know, I knew I was in a lot of pain, but I've been in a lot of pain before and it wasn't deadly. So consciously, I didn't realize why this dead person was asking me if I was going to die there. And then later when I found out that it was potassium deficiency and that you can die from it, it was really freaky to think about. So in 2021, I was still married and I thankfully had some money come through and I was able to start buying more food. And I ended up putting on 40 pounds that year. And I got out of that marriage and I got back home to the US. But since I could barely lift my body, I couldn't go work. I couldn't even sit up at a computer some days. I had nowhere to go but my parents' house, which thankfully my grandma had just moved out of, so there was a spot for me there. And I was almost out of money because all of those things were really expensive. So I found myself 40 years old, like completely beaten down, living at my parents' house, going through a divorce. But during that time was when I was able to figure out what was going on with my body and figure out that it was potassium deficiency. I started drinking electrolytes every single day and it was like the lights came back on in my body. After a while, I was like able to go on a walk. I still remember when I was able to finally like lift grocery bags again and I could help my parents carry the groceries in. Like I felt like a superhero. Like I could not do that before. Like I had gotten so weak from the potassium deficiency that I couldn't lift just regular groceries. And as my body started working better, I started thinking about my future again. And that's when my off-grid dream seemed like something that I might be able to do. So I got to planning. Things were like chugging along. I was doing my research. I reached a point where I could start looking for land, and I was looking for land all the time. Not really finding much of anything, not hearing back from anyone. I tried finding a realtor for a long time and no one would even call me back. And I realized that's because they don't really make a big commission off of selling cheaper plots of land. So a lot of realtors don't even want to deal with it. But I ended up finding a realtor that would work with me, which was really nice. And he even found me a few properties that I made offers on, and for different reasons, those fell through. That was super disheartening at the time, but it was really good that they fell through because two things happened during this time. Okay, I'm back. I got interrupted and it's like way later in the day now, but I'm gonna keep going. I found out that in South Carolina, you can only have a composting toilet on your property if it's deemed like rural enough. And I was looking at rural properties, yet none of them were considered rural enough. They're super strict there about it. So I was realizing that this huge part of my plan, like not having to deal with plumbing, not having to pay a sewer bill, was not going to pan out in South Carolina. The other thing that happened at this time was my parents flew down to Florida to visit family, and while they were there, they bought a house. And they came back and they said they were moving in 5 months. So it was really good that I didn't buy the land in South Carolina because I wouldn't have been able to do my plan, which was live with them while I built. I considered moving to Florida with them, but I had so much gear that I had collected in their attic in South Carolina. Because I had all that gear, if I wanted to bring it down to Florida, I would have to pay for a storage unit. And I already had this tiny budget. And on top of it, I would be paying like this monthly fee for a storage unit. I felt like I couldn't do that. I would just be throwing my money away to store my gear to never be able to afford to build because the money to build would be gone. The other downside to Florida is land is expensive there. And then I'd have to start from scratch reading and learning about the permitting laws and basically be redoing all this research that I already did in South Carolina. The other downside is I'd be living just a few miles from my lame, abusive, compulsive, lying older sister, which I really was not interested in doing. I'd already been in no contact with her for 10 years because of her behavior, so living in close proximity and being exposed to her all the time, like that did not sound like a good idea. So I was pretty stressed out and trying to figure out what to do. And then my parents' builder called and said, oh, hey, actually the house is not going to be ready in 5 months. It's going to be ready in 3. That was extremely stressful. I had 3 months to figure out what I was going to do. South Carolina was not going to work. Florida was not going to work. No matter where I bought, I would have to figure out the permit laws. And that made me think about New Mexico. New Mexico had always been on my radar just because I'd always hear talk about how certain counties in New Mexico have really relaxed building laws. I had even looked into buying property there, looked around, and I was pretty familiar with a couple counties where I knew that I could build what I needed to build. There was one subdivision in particular that I had looked into quite a bit, and they even have a Facebook group, so I had read through that quite a bit, and I already knew like how people were surviving there, what kind of issues were coming up for them. I knew what part of the subdivision you needed to be in order to have the most relaxed, like unrestricted building laws. And I knew that the land was so much cheaper there that if I bought land there, I had to move all my gear out. The cheaper cost of the land could help offset the cost of the move. So at this point, everything felt like all signs were pointing to New Mexico. That is where I needed to go. But one huge caveat is that completely changed my building plans, because no longer could I count on, sleeping at my parents' house, being able to do laundry there, being able to store most of my gear there, things like that. I would now be living on my land full-time while building. At this point, I just dove in doing a ton of research of what would I need while living off-grid to build, to try to make it as comfortable and doable as possible, because I know I need certain things. I need to be able to keep my food cold, and I didn't want to be running into town constantly, wasting time, money, and gas getting ice, and so many things like that. I want to be able to shower after a long, grubby, dirty, hot day. Handling certain issues like that beforehand, I knew would help me in spades in the long run once I was on my property. So I researched solar showers and I bought one. I researched solar ovens and I bought one, a solar cooler, and I got one. I built out my own first aid kit just to have something on hand, because I knew I'd be buying property probably around an hour from the nearest hospital. If you want to see what I ended up putting in my first aid kit, I'll put a link to the video in the description box below. I think I forgot to mention I even bought a solar generator. I tried to buy the best rated and reviewed one in my price range. Collecting those solar items really helped put me at ease. I felt more and more like, okay, I have some kind of foundation, like I have these foundational things that I can rely on out there to survive, but I still didn't have my land. I had been looking and looking in that subdivision I was interested in, and there were no plots in my price range available. And the weeks were ticking by. It was really stressful. Thankfully, 1 month out from moving, I got an email from Hemingway Land, and they had an acre in that subdivision available. It checked all the boxes of what I was looking for, and it was in part of the subdivision that was unrestricted, which is what I really needed. So I looked through all the details, and then I looked through all the details again, and then I bought it. And that was another of many moments where I found like a huge amount of relief, like, okay, I know where I'm going. Like, this big problem that I needed to solve is finally solved. This is where I'm going. I have gear to survive out there. Now I need to get my move figured out. I thought about getting a U-Haul and driving it out there and towing my car behind me, but ultimately a multi-day road trip trying to tow my car just did not feel right. So I ended up opting for moving cubes. I went with U-Packet because they were more affordable than pods. They were also willing to deliver to coordinates out in the desert. I knew it could take about a month before I got the deed for my land, which I needed before I could leave. But I also knew my parents were selling their home and they needed to be out of the house by a certain date. So it worked out really well that about a week before they were set to move out was the month time frame for me to get my deed. So I scheduled my moving pods for that week. I was really worried that my deed was not going to show up in time, but I got really lucky. That final week, the week that my pods were scheduled to arrive, it was also the week that I was scheduled to start my road trip out to New Mexico. That Monday, so the very beginning of the week, is when my deed showed up. So it was perfect timing. So Monday I had the deed, Wednesday I had my pods packed up and picked up, and then Friday I hit the road. My car was super full. I brought my camping gear with me, like my solar cooler, my sleeping bag, and everything, because I got really worried that what if something happened with the pods and my camping gear didn't make it out there. I at least wanted to be able to survive on my land, even if I didn't have all my building gear. So I chose to bring it in my car with me so that it would be with me at all times. But that meant my car was packed to the brim. And that may sound paranoid to some people that I wanted to have it with me, but when I moved back to the US from Germany, they lost a bunch of my stuff, and that was just 2 years prior, and so it's still really fresh in my mind that movers can lose your things, and I didn't have money in my budget to replace this stuff if it got lost. And I know there's like a certain amount of insurance that movers have, but it took me almost 2 years to get refunded from my move from Germany to the US, and of course it was like a fraction of what the stuff was worth. So I did not want to risk that. So with my car packed full that Friday morning, I hit the road for Knoxville, Tennessee, and that was where a friend of mine was waiting for me to do the rest of the road trip with me. If you'd like to hear more of my story of moving off grid and failing, please be sure to hit like and subscribe. It's a good way to let me know that this is something that's interesting for you. And if you're feeling especially generous, there's a link in the description box below where you can help support me in different ways, like buying yourself a cool alien sticker, picking up one of my element pillows, grabbing a roll of wallpaper or some fabric that I've designed, or even pick up a copy of a found diary that I transcribed. I changed all the names to preserve the author's privacy. In the next video, I'll talk about my arrival to New Mexico and what it was like trying to establish my land. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.